What happened in your childhood that still feels like a punch to the stomach whenever you think about it? I was 4 when my dad married my stepmom, who had 3 children. One night, my sister and I were woken by our dad, his voice angry, ordering us into the kitchen. The cabinets were open, food scattered, and on the table was a pile of cookies, candy bars, and snacks. "Go ahead, eat whatever you want," my dad said, his eyes blazing. My stepmom and her kids stood silent, their faces pale. Scared and confused, my sister and I began eating. I tried a snack cake I'd never had and offered it to my stepsister. Before she could respond, my dad snatched it from my hand and threw it back on the table. "No," he barked. "I said you eat it." My sister, trembling, asked, "What's going on?" My stepmom snapped, "Just eat." The tension was unbearable. We forced down a few bites before saying we weren't hungry and going back to bed. Years later, I realized my stepmom had been hiding snacks and giving them only to her kids. That night, my dad discovered it. It was a harsh reminder of how little we mattered to her compared to her own children.
I love my backpack. It's nothing special, just a basic Element rucksack. I picked it out myself, and it's the only designer brand item I own. A few years ago, while backpacking across Canada, we stopped in Hope, BC for a meal before heading to Kay, where we'd booked accommodation. When we arrived and unpacked the car, I realized my backpack was missing. It had my passport, house keys, iPad, cash, sweatshirt, and phone charger. I panicked, thinking it might have been stolen. The next morning, I called the diner, and they confirmed my backpack was there. I asked them to ship it to Kayla using the cash inside, and they agreed. Since it didn't arrive before we left for a week-long camping trip in Alberta, I asked the Airbnb host to forward it to Calgary. The camping trip was incredible. Surrounded by the Rockies, I almost forgot about everything I'd lost. I finally understood Bilbo's words in The Lord of the Rings. "I want to see mountains again, Gandalf, mountains." When we got to Calgary, it was Canada Day, so everything was closed. The next morning, I was first in line at the UPS store. Seeing my burgundy bag was such a relief, and everything was there except for $40 in shipping costs. Whenever I see my backpack now, I'm reminded of the kindness of strangers and that unforgettable trip through an amazing country.
I refuse to speak to my cheating dad's new kid, and it's causing problems. I'm 15, and my parents divorced last year because my dad cheated. He quickly married the woman he had an affair with. I chose to live with my mom, but I'm still required to visit my dad every other weekend. At first, I resisted, but it caused legal stress for my mom, so I agreed, with conditions. His wife stays out of my business, and I can stay in my room except for one family activity. Every visit, my dad picks me up, tries to talk to me, and I don't engage. We attend family therapy, and I spend the rest of the time in my room, except for the required activity. The main issue now is his wife's kids, age 12 and 9. The younger one is polite, but the 12-year-old keeps bothering me, barging into my room uninvited, wanting to talk. I told her I'm not interested and won't respond anymore. She cried, her mom got mad, and my dad accused me of taking out the divorce on her. Now everyone's upset, and my mom says the girl just wants someone to talk to. I don't see why it has to be me.
What single moment made you lose faith in humanity? I used to work as a dancer at a private club. One evening, a sad-looking older man came in holding $10,000 in cash. I quickly told him to hide it before anyone noticed. After he did, he shyly asked me for a dance. I held his hand as we walked to the VIP area as he struggled with arthritis. When we got to the booth, I noticed him tearing up. I asked if he was okay, and that's when he broke down, crying harder than I'd ever seen. I wiped his tears and held him as he told me about his wife who had passed away while pregnant. He blamed himself and had spent his life wishing he could bring her back. To cheer him up, I started sharing stories about the kids I cared for at a daycare where I used to work. He smiled when I mentioned a little girl named Ellie, which was the name he and his wife had picked for their baby. We eventually noticed we had gone over time. He pulled out a stack of $100 bills and placed it on the table for me. I hugged him, but over his shoulder, I saw 2 dancers watching the money. They bribed the bouncer to kick us out for breaking the rules. The bouncer took the money and split it with. I never went back to that club, but I didn't care. That money couldn't compare to the bond we formed. We stayed in touch, and our friendship means far more than anything that was stolen. I got my revenge on a school bully. Back in school, I was endlessly tormented. 2 girls, in particular, seemed to make it their mission to make my life miserable. I was quiet, loved books, and stayed away from the popular crowd, making me an easy target. They'd even go so far as to corner me on the staircase when no one was around and stick pinboard pins into my arms, legs, and feet. Years later, karma gave me the perfect opportunity. I visited a new ice cream shop, and guess who was behind the counter? One of those girls. I have several food allergies, including milk and gluten, and the shop advertised that they were very careful with allergens. I ordered a gluten and dairy-free ice cream and, suspicious of her, discreetly set up my phone to record the preparation area. Sure enough, I caught her in the act. She deliberately sabotaged my order, sneaking a spoonful of milk into the bowl, crumbling gluten-laden wafers over the ice cream, and covering it all with a final scoop to hide her actions. When she placed the bowl in front of me with a smug look and said, "Hope you enjoy it," I just smiled sweetly and calmly asked if the owner could come out, because I wanted to thank them for accommodating allergies so well. When the owner arrived, I showed her the video and informed her that I'd like to press charges. That bully will never work in any job involving food again, and now she'll carry a criminal record for years. Sweet justice served cold, just like ice cream.
My mother tried to trick me into having dinner with my sister after she tested me with her husband. My sister recently got married, and during a family dinner, her husband acted inappropriately. He made uncomfortable comments about my body, ignored my sister entirely, and made me so uneasy, I left early. I was shocked, and later I messaged my sister, expecting her to be just as upset. She didn't reply until the next day, asking me to come over. Instead of being angry at him, she told me it was all a setup. She had asked him to say those things to test whether I could be trusted around him. I was speechless. She thought I needed to be tested. It felt like a massive betrayal. This reminded me of her first husband, who secretly stole my underwear, and later admitted he married her to get closer to me. I pressed charges, and she divorced him, but even then she blamed me. Now she was accusing me again with this test. I told her to never contact me again. Most of my family supported me, but my mom defended her actions. At the next family dinner, I was ambushed. My sister and her husband demanded an apology. I snapped, told her to delete my number, and walked out. Now, I don't know how to face them again.
What's the biggest lie you've ever gotten away with? In 7th grade English, we had a project where we had to pick a long novel, read it, and give an oral book report to the class, complete with a Q&A. I chose The Shining. If I'd actually started reading it, I would have realized it's a page turner. But as a 7th grader, it just looked like a really long book that wasn't as fun as video games. The teacher gave us a few minutes of class time to read, but as the deadline got closer, she noticed I hadn't made much progress. She kept reminding me to read at home, and I kept reassuring her I was a fast reader and would finish in time. The day before the presentation came, and I hadn't read a single page. Naturally, I rented the movie instead. I watched it twice to make sure I didn't miss anything. During my presentation, I kept my descriptions of the plot as vague as possible and sprinkled in some commentary about Stephen King's writing style that I found online. I answered my classmates' questions without a problem, but my teacher looked skeptical the whole time. It made sense. There's a very popular movie adaptation of The Shining, and it was obvious I wasn't anywhere near finishing the book. She wasn't dumb, and I knew I had to wrap up by letting her ask a question. That's when I got nervous. Finally, she asked, "Yes, I was wondering if you could tell us some of the major differences between the book and the movie." For a split second, my heart sank. Then I gave her my answer. "I'm sorry, I don't know. I've never seen the movie." People who've woken up in bed with a stranger. What's your story? This isn't exactly waking up in bed with someone, but it's close. I had 3 roommates I wasn't particularly close to, and I mostly just used the apartment to sleep. One day, a guy started hanging around, always in his underwear, often playing video games that belonged to my roommates. I assumed he was a friend of one of the others. After about a week, one of my roommates asked how long my friend planned to crash on the couch and told me to ask him to stop playing their games without permission. I replied, "I don't know him. I thought he was your or Justin's friend." No one knew who he was. We had a quick meeting to figure out what to do. I found the whole situation hilarious and suggested leaving him alone to see how it played out, but the others could handle it however they wanted. A few days passed, and no one had confronted him. He was still there. Then I came home to find him playing video games with 2 of my roommates, chatting like old friends. This went on for another week or 2, and then one day, he was just gone. No goodbyes, no explanation. I think about that guy often. The sheer audacity to walk into a random apartment, take over the couch, and stay for weeks is something I'll never forget.
What's something a teacher did to you that you'll never forget? This didn't happen to me personally, but it was during my junior year when a rumor started circulating. People whispered about Mr. Tanner, a teacher, being too close to Caleb, a quiet boy in our grade. At first, no one took it seriously. One afternoon, I stayed late working on a project and heard voices coming from Mr. Tanner's classroom. Curious, I looked through the small window on the door. What I saw confirmed something inappropriate was happening. After that, the rumor exploded. Everywhere, cafeteria, hallways, locker rooms, people were talking about Mr. Tanner and Caleb. The jokes turned cruel, and Caleb started shrinking into himself, avoiding eye contact and looking defeated. Then one morning, we learned Caleb had taken his own life. The principal made an announcement offering condolences, but no one addressed the real reason. The grief and guilt were heavy, and the atmosphere at school felt suffocating. Mr. Tanner disappeared later that week, and the police started asking questions. We all felt responsible, like we'd let the rumors spiral out of control and destroy Caleb. I still think about him, how he sat alone at lunch, trying not to be noticed. He didn't deserve the shame that was forced onto him. And I'll never forget how one rumor and one teacher's unforgivable actions extinguished a life far too soon.
Guys, when was the last time you cried? For me, it was during a tough period in my life. I was juggling 2 jobs, barely scraping by to pay rent. One night, while heading to my shift, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. When I picked up, I heard a man with a heavy accent saying my name. He was sobbing, and it was hard to make out his words. At first, I was confused, but eventually he explained that his 4-year-old son was dying and urgently needed a blood donor. I really needed the money, but without hesitation, I called in sick and drove straight to the hospital. When I arrived, I learned that the man and his son had recently moved from another country. They were the only ones left in their family. He explained that he had spent the entire day calling through a list of donors and that I was his last hope. He kept thanking me over and over, and even the doctors said they admired what I was doing, but warned me that the boy might not make it. 2 months later, I received another call from that same number. The father told me it was his son's birthday and asked if I could come since they had no other family. Of course, I said yes. I brought a small gift and went to celebrate with him. When I walked in, his son saw me and lit up with the biggest smile I had ever seen. The father told me that they now consider me part of their family because my blood saved his son's life. His son hugged me tightly and said, "You're my hero." It was a moment I'll never forget. How does a high school legend actually become a legend? During one of our school dances, a heavy hailstorm hit and the power went out. Everyone ended up stuck in the gym, waiting out the storm together. To lighten the mood, one of the teachers suggested that students get up and tell jokes. At first, it worked. Students were laughing, but after a few jokes, the energy started to fizzle out. Then, another kid stepped up to the mic. He stood there silently for a few seconds before finally saying, "So, how deep are we willing to go, guys?" Without missing a beat, the entire gym erupted, yelling, "Balls deep!" He was immediately pulled off the stage, and the joke-telling ended for the night. From what I remember, he got sent home and didn't show up at school the next day. Pretty standard stuff. Fast forward a year to graduation. At the end of the ceremony, instead of joke-telling, the school had karaoke. Midway through a song, the microphone mysteriously disappeared. As everyone was sitting in their seats, one guy stood up laughing. Turns out, someone had slipped him the missing mic. Teachers were frantically telling him not to do it, but he couldn't stop laughing. He raised the microphone and, with perfect timing, said, "How deep?" In that moment, I finally understood what school pride felt like. Almost 900 students yelled back in unison, "Balls deep." It was an unforgettable moment.
Parents who have disowned their child. I'm not a parent and have never disowned a child, but my parents disowned my oldest sister years ago. I'm the youngest of 3 sisters, and my oldest sibling always had a toxic relationship with our dad. At 16, she had her first baby out of spite, then got involved with a deadbeat child predator and ended up having 6 daughters. My dad tried to support her kids, sending money for Christmas and birthdays, but my sister always prioritized her partner over her children. Eventually, my dad gave up. In June, after years without contact, we heard from her again when my oldest niece reached out, asking if she and her sisters could stay with me in Florida to escape their conditions. I agreed, arranged plane tickets, and prepared rooms. When they arrived, I was horrified. Their clothes were filthy, they smelled foul, and they were so infested with lice that my towels turned gray after cleaning them. My niece revealed they had been without water and electricity for 6 months in a trailer infested with rats and bugs. As a family, we decided the girls wouldn't go back. We invited my sister to Florida to start fresh, but she refused because her deadbeat partner wasn't welcome. After confronting him about cheating, he kicked her out. Now she works at a dollar store and barely manages to support outsmart herself, but at least the girls are safe with us.
How did you manage to outsmart the system? Back when I was in college, my professor accidentally attached answer sheets to the back of every test. It was our final exam, the one that practically decided our futures. When we realized what had happened, the entire class started exchanging glances. Our professor then left the room, giving us the perfect opportunity to come up with a plan. We all agreed to tear off the answer sheets before turning in our tests, but we'd also tweak some answers to avoid suspicion. Everyone was clearly on edge, but somehow our professor didn't notice. As time ran out, the class stood up to submit their tests. I was still stuck on the last question, which simply said, answers will vary. On my way to turn in my paper, I quickly glanced at what others had written. What I saw left me stunned. 3 different people had literally written, answers will vary, as their response. I couldn't believe it and nearly burst out laughing, but managed to keep it together as I walked out, hoping we'd all get away with it. The next day, when our professor entered the classroom, he had a stern expression. Broke the news, he caught us, and everyone failed the exam except for 2 students. When I got my test back, I saw I scored 92. I glanced around and locked eyes with the only other person smiling in the room. We had survived.
What did your child's school nurse do that made you lose your patience? Every morning, I drive my 7-year-old daughter Madison to school. I kiss her cheek, tell her I love her, and watch her walk in. One morning, after dropping her off, I went to the laundromat. As I started loading the machines, the school nurse called. Madison has a curling iron burn on her cheek, she said. I froze. How? I had just dropped her off and she was fine. I told her I'd come right away, then called my husband, who got there first. At school, they brought Madison to the office. My husband saw a faint red mark and explained, we don't even own a curling iron. The nurse applied ointment and sent Madison back to class. When I arrived, Madison was called to the office again, but this time, there was no mark. The nurse flustered, insisted it had been there earlier. Relieved it wasn't serious, I knelt, kissed Madison's cheek, and sent her back to class. Suddenly, the nurse exclaimed, there it is! See? It wasn't a burn, it was my lipstick. Every morning, I'd been leaving a faint mark. Furious at the misunderstanding, I left the school, deciding to switch to lip balm instead.
My parents hate me for telling the truth. I'm 17 now, but when I was 9, my dad cheated on my mom with her friend. They got married and had 3 kids. I visited on weekends, but it always felt forced. He even pushed me to call his wife mom and wanted full custody, though I never felt comfortable there. By 14, I stopped visiting. His new family always seemed more important. His wife was cold and once told me I was an obstacle to his happiness and should just stay with my mom. Recently, for their anniversary, my dad forced me to come to dinner, even threatening court. At the restaurant, he announced he had 6 vacation tickets, 1 for me. I thanked him, but said I wasn't going. When he pushed for a reason, I snapped, because I hate your wife. I told him everything she'd said to me. Dinner ended in silence. I called my stepdad to pick me up and haven't spoken to my dad since. His wife called me a brat, blaming me for ruining my half-siblings' lives. My cousin says my dad's staying with my grandparents and that I should have handled it differently, but I don't think I should have. How did you manage to scam the scammer? Here's what happened. I got a call from someone claiming to be Officer Johnson from the IRS, warning me about serious tax fraud charges. You know the routine. You're going to jail unless you pay right now. My heart did skip a beat at first since I was a bit behind on filing that year. This guy was full of threats, freezing accounts, seizing assets, all delivered in that fake authoritative tone that screams, I'm reading off a script. Instead of hanging up, I decided to mess with him. I played the terrified taxpayer perfectly. Oh, no, officer, how can I fix this? I'll do anything. Then came the classic scammer line, you can pay with gift cards. I nearly laughed but kept my cool. I told him I'd buy the cards, but instead of hanging up, I muted my phone and watched Netflix. After 40 minutes, I came back sounding apologetic. Sorry, officer, the first store didn't have enough cards. This went on for almost an hour. I made up excuses, asked dumb questions about card denominations, and drove him nuts. The final straw, I said I'd accidentally redeemed 1 card to test it. He completely lost it and hung up. Mission accomplished.
I was cheering for my brother when his jealous girlfriend suddenly threatened me. My brother and I have always been close, rarely argued, and always supported one another. He invited me to his football game, and I cheered loudly every time he scored or touched the ball. There was a girl in front of me cheering too, and I assumed she was his girlfriend. During a break, I overheard her saying, that girl won't stop cheering for my boyfriend. I ignored it, but she kept ranting about how she'd beat up whoever cheered for him because only she was allowed to. After the game, I rushed to congratulate my brother. When I hugged him, she shoved me away and slapped me across the face, leaving everyone in shock. My brother stepped in to protect me, but then he called her babe. When I touched his arm, she yelled, get your hands off my boyfriend or I'll gut you like a pig. Her words terrified me, and I could tell she meant it. Although my brother defended me, something between us felt different. I went home with a throbbing face, and my parents were furious. They told my brother to break up with her or face consequences. He apologized to me later, but I couldn't shake the feeling that things might never be the same again. I think my dad might have killed someone. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, one night my dad took my little brother and me to Blockbuster to pick out some movies. This was in the mid-90s, so that kind of outing was a typical family thing back then. After we finished at Blockbuster, my dad stopped at a corner store to grab some snacks. He parked on the side of the building and left my brother and me in the car while he went inside. On his way out, I saw a man come up behind him and press something against his side. At first, it looked like my dad was going to hand over his wallet, but instead, he suddenly elbowed the guy in the face, knocking him to the ground. The man got back up and came at him with a knife. My dad managed to wrestle it away, but what happened next shocked me. He stabbed the man with his own knife. I can still hear the awful groan the man let out. It was long and haunting, and that sound stuck with me. The guy was left writhing on the ground as my dad jumped back into the car and sped off. For a long time, I thought maybe it was just some strange dream, until my little brother brought it up one day asking if I remembered it. We've never mentioned it to our dad, not even once. I've always wondered what happened to that man, but this was before cell phones or anything like that. Finally saying it out loud feels like I'm letting go of a weight I didn't even realize I'd been carrying.
I've been keeping a secret from my husband for the past 8 years. We met on April 1st, 2011. That November, for his birthday, I asked about his favorite cake flavor so I could bake it for him. He said yellow cake with chocolate frosting. I made everything from scratch and decorated it the best I could. He loved it. I promised I'd make him the same cake every year, and I have 8 cakes in total. On March 3rd, 2012, my birthday, the first we celebrated together, he made me dinner and proudly presented dessert, yellow cake with chocolate frosting. He was so proud of it, and I could tell he put a lot of effort into making it. It was one of the sweetest gestures anyone had ever done for me. I ate 2 slices. The truth is, I don't like yellow cake with chocolate frosting, but every year he makes it for my birthday, and it's become our tradition. Oddly enough, I find myself looking forward to it each year. Today is March 3rd. While helping him unpack groceries, I noticed the ingredients: sugar, vanilla extract, and cacao powder. When I asked if he was baking soon, he smiled brightly. I love this man so much. I'll never tell him how I feel about yellow cake with chocolate frosting. Maybe one day I'll even grow to love it. I won the lottery, but kept it hidden from my struggling family. After taxes, my winnings came to just under $4 million. I paid off my debts, repaired my truck, hired an accountant, and tucked most of it into savings. I didn't quit my job or move because my family's a disaster. My brother is addicted to meth, my sister is selfish and prone to violence, and my mom still blames everything on my late dad. I didn't want them pretending to care about me just for money. I've been with my girlfriend for 3 years, and I recently proposed. She said yes, so I bought her a modest ring to keep my secret. I wanted to be sure she loved me for who I was, not for the money. Once I felt confident, I planned to tell her. We had a rare weekend off together, so we went out for dinner, caught a movie, and grabbed drinks afterward. During the evening, I told her we'd never have to worry about money and she could make any decision she wanted about her job. She looked shocked, so I handed her a financial statement and explained that I'd won the lottery before we met. Instead of being overjoyed, she started crying. It wasn't happiness, it was fear. She confessed she had $440,000 in debt and was terrified I'd leave her for hiding it. After a long conversation, we agreed to a prenup. I'll clear her debt once we're married, but my winnings will remain mine. Now, I'm finally quitting my job so we can take time off and enjoy life together.
I overheard my husband talking to our daughter, and now I can't stop crying. 9 months ago, when we found out I was pregnant, my husband changed completely. He became overly protective, even insisting on carrying me everywhere, including to the bathroom. At first, it was sweet, but it quickly became overwhelming. He kept saying he was terrified something might happen to me or the baby. 2 days ago, I went into labor, and he was more scared than I was. His hands shook as he reassured me, but the fear in his eyes was clear. After our daughter was born, I passed out from exhaustion. When I woke, I heard him speaking softly to her. "You have the most beautiful mommy in the world," he whispered. "She's strong, kind, and she saved me." He went on to tell her about the abuse he suffered from his parents, how they hurt him for not being perfect and forced him into things he hated. But then he met me, and despite his painful past, he said he didn't regret it because it led him to me. Lying there, tears filled my eyes. I realized how deeply he loves me and how much we'd saved each other. His love was always there, stronger than I knew, and in that moment, I felt like the luckiest woman alive.
I just realized I'm actually jealous of my 6-year-old. This morning, I woke up and found him sitting on the couch, fully dressed and ready for school, an hour earlier than he needed to be. Surprised, I asked, "Hey buddy, why are you up so early?" He casually explained, "I accidentally peed the bed around 4 o'clock. I tried waking you up, but you didn't, so I took off my blankets, left them by the laundry room, and changed. Then I came out here." I thanked him for handling it on his own, and reassured him it was no big deal, promising we'd get everything cleaned and ready for his bed later. I reminded him to try peeing before bed next time, and added the usual accidents happen pep talk. Afterward, he got up and started making his breakfast while I made coffee. As I sat there sipping my coffee, a thought struck me. I'm jealous of my kid. It took me back to when I was his age and used to wet the bed. My first instinct back then wasn't to wake my parents. Absolutely not. I knew they'd lose it and probably beat me. Instead, I'd sneak to the bathroom, grab a roll of toilet paper, and try to dry the soaked sheets myself because I was terrified of their reaction. But my son, he doesn't live with that kind of fear. He felt safe enough to try waking me up, and when I didn't respond, he simply handled it himself, knowing it wasn't a big deal. I can't help but wish I'd felt that same sense of safety and comfort when I was his age. My girlfriend kicks me off my Spotify account every morning, and honestly, I couldn't be happier. She's 22, I'm 23, and we live together. My day starts much earlier than hers. I'm usually at the office by 6:30 a.m., right around the time she's waking up. Since I'm one of the first to arrive at work, I start my morning with headphones and some music. But after about 15 minutes, my music stops, and I get a notification saying the output device has changed. This happens because our Google Home device is linked to my Spotify account. When she wakes up, she says, "Hey, Google, play," so she can listen to music while getting ready. I leave my phone open to see what she's listening to, and by 7:30, when she leaves, I get my account back. She has no idea she's part of this routine, and I don't plan on telling her. I like knowing she's starting her day with her favorite songs. It's also a bonus because I can play her favorite songs later when we're in the car or just hanging out. Some days, I think she might be onto me, but it doesn't matter. We're both happy, and I'm planning to propose in a few weeks. I was asleep in bed at 7 a.m. when I suddenly heard a loud bang. Thinking it was just the cat tree downstairs, I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. A short while later, my elderly cat ran into the bedroom, jumped onto the bed, and hid under the blankets. That woke me up instantly because she hadn't done anything like that in years. As I became fully awake, I saw 2 men coming up the stairs. Time felt frozen and fast at the same time. I jumped out of bed, screaming, "Get out of my house!" I chased them through the house, yelling. I managed to tackle one of them on my front lawn, but he fought free and escaped. I saw their getaway car and tried to memorize the license plate number, but it kept slipping from my mind. Later, I realized I had fractured my arm slamming into the wall and cut my feet on splinters from the broken door. The adrenaline in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Fortunately, I wasn't seriously hurt and nothing was stolen. The next day, I installed cameras around my house. If you need to pee more than twice a day, you're going to need a doctor's note. While cleaning out my home office, I found paperwork from a terrible call center job I had 15 years ago. It was an outbound sales role with constant calls, and the job was awful. Talking all day made your voice crack unless you stayed hydrated, so I'd bring jugs of water to sip on. Naturally, this meant frequent trips to the restroom. I never abused these breaks. They were always under 3 minutes, but management wasn't happy. One day, my manager told me I'd need a doctor's note to use the bathroom outside of my 2 scheduled breaks. So I made an appointment and explained the situation to my doctor. He thought it was hilarious that my manager either didn't understand biology or was on a power trip. He wrote me the most condescending note. To whom it may concern, this letter pertains to my patient who requires frequent fluid intake to prevent his voice from becoming hoarse. As a result, he must urinate every 60 to 90 minutes. Please excuse these brief trips to the restroom, as they are unavoidable. Sincerely, Greg, MD Doc. My manager wasn't thrilled, but my coworkers loved it and got similar notes from the same doctor. I couldn't help but grin every time I walked to the bathroom after that. Ever had to deal with an entitled customer? I used to work at Disneyland as Goofy, and I loved it. Staying in character, no matter how hot it got in those costumes, was a strict rule we all followed. Only my close friends knew I was the one inside the suit. One day, as I was finishing my shift, a woman started yelling at me. She accused me of ignoring her kids because they were black and threatened to get me fired. Truthfully, I just hadn't seen. To calm the situation, I went back, greeted the kids, took a picture, and left to take off my costume. After my break, the woman returned with my manager, still accusing me of being racist and ignoring her kids. My manager assured her I would never do such a thing, but she kept yelling, now directing her insults at both of us. I noticed my manager fighting back laughter, and then he gave me a nod. I instantly understood. Making sure no one else was looking, I quietly pulled up my sleeve to reveal my black skin. Her face froze, and the look of shock was absolutely priceless. That moment, unforgettable. Divorce lawyers. What's the craziest way you've seen one spouse try to screw over the other? This story hits close to home because it happened between my parents. They decided to use a family friend who was a lawyer to act as a mediator for both of them. As the assets were being divided, my dad ended up getting completely blindsided. My mom was set to take the house, the cars, half of his retirement, and a ridiculous amount of alimony, around $2,500 a month for the rest of her life. My dad had a solid job as a municipal employee, but that alimony was about 70% of his paycheck. He had no idea how divorce settlements typically worked, so he assumed this was normal. What he didn't realize at the time was that my mom and the family friend had secretly conspired to scam him. They made it look like this was just a standard divorce settlement, but the plan was for her to secretly kick back some of the money to the lawyer after everything was finalized. Thankfully, after a lot of convincing, my dad decided to get his own lawyer. Once he did, he ended up with a much fairer divorce settlement. Even now, my mom still can't seem to understand why we don't talk to her much. Fathers who went to get milk and never came back. What happened? When my wife and I found out she was pregnant with twins, I had no choice but to take a job in another country to support them. While I was away, I never really thought about what life would be like once I came back. After 2 years, I returned home to a completely different life. We were now living in another state where I had no friends or family nearby. My wife had changed a lot, and I was overwhelmed trying to handle the kids. I wasn't prepared for this new reality. That night, my wife and I had a conversation about our future together, but in my heart, I'd already made my decision. I had saved up some money and planned to leave it all for them. The next morning, I told my wife I needed to run to the store, struggling to hold myself together. As I was leaving, my daughter overheard and ran up to me. She said, "Daddy, bring me back a surprise." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks, and I barely managed to keep from breaking down. I could see her waving goodbye as I drove away. I pulled onto a busy street, parked my car, and cried my eyes out for an hour. That day, instead of leaving, I went back home. I walked in with toys for my girls and a new ring for my wife. She gave me a look like she knew something was off, but she didn't say a word about it. From that day forward, I got my life together. Years later, I couldn't be happier with my family. Leaving them would have been the worst mistake of my life. Ever convinced your friend to ask out their crush? My best friend was a total introvert with a huge crush on a girl from one of his classes. He'd constantly talk about her and ask me for advice on how to approach her. One night, I finally told him, just go for it. The worst she can say is no. A few days later, we were walking down a hallway when his crush appeared, heading toward us. I glanced at him and saw him take a deep breath. He said, wish me luck, and walked over to meet her. I watched as they talked. His face turned bright red, and he was so nervous he couldn't make eye contact. His hands were fidgeting like crazy. But then I noticed something else. She was smiling at him, giving him this look as if she found him endearing. The big moment came when he pulled out his phone and handed it to her. She took it, typed something in, handed it back, and gave his hand a little rub. As she walked away, I could hear her giggling. He came back to me with a level of confidence I'd never seen before and said, I got her number. I was so proud of him. The best part, 8 years and 3 kids later, they're still together. I even got to be the best man at their wedding. Don't tell anyone you're leaving, okay? Sure, I won't. About 10 years ago, I had my first full-time job after college, and my boss seemed to decide out of nowhere that she hated me. I never figured out why, but she went out of her way to make my life miserable. She demoted me to an overnight shift without an explanation, constantly changed my schedule without notice, and even once altered my shift for the next day after I'd already left, then wrote me up when I didn't show up on time. She was a nightmare. So naturally, I started looking for a new job and eventually found one. When I went to give her my 2 weeks notice, it just so happened to be during a mass exodus at the company. I was the 5th person to quit in about 3 or 4 weeks. Morale was already rock bottom, and her solution to people leaving was to buy pizza for everyone, instead of addressing why the workplace was so miserable. After I handed in my notice, she looked at me and said, "Don't tell anyone you're leaving." I smiled and said, "Okay," then walked straight out of her office and announced to my coworkers, "Guess what, everyone? You're all getting pizza." They immediately knew what was up. She was furious, and I couldn't have been happier. I finished my 2 weeks, and she didn't say another word to me the entire time. Honestly, it was the most satisfying exit I could have hoped for. Divorce lawyers. What's the most ruthless way you've seen someone get back at their spouse? I worked with a guy who pulled off the ultimate act of revenge on his ex-wife. He stood out among us 8-an-hour workers, polished, educated, and unusually confident. One evening, I noticed him driving away in a sleek Jaguar. Curious, I asked how he could afford such a car on minimum wage. He explained that he'd been a senior VP at a Fortune 50 company, earning over $300K a year. During his divorce, his ex demanded their house and 40% of his salary for life. His lawyer proposed a counteroffer. She could take 75% of his future earnings if she left the house alone. Greedy for more money, she agreed. Then came his twist. He quit his high-paying job and took our minimum wage gig. She was left with 75% of almost nothing. Meanwhile, he kept the house, had savings, and still drove a luxury car. She tried to sue, claiming she couldn't sustain her lifestyle. In court, he calmly explained that emotional stress had made it impossible for him to return to his old job. Her jaw dropped. She had trapped herself in her greed. It was brutal, calculated, and unforgettable.
Waiters, what's the worst first date you've ever seen? A good-looking guy was at the bar, talking about a date with a girl his best friend secretly liked. The friend had never made a move because the girl was into him. As the guy was sharing his story, she arrived, stunning, in a black dress and heels. They exchanged a kiss and started taking tequila shots. At one point, he whistled at me and said, "Yo, man, more shots." I poured them, making it clear I wasn't okay with being whistled at. He brushed it off and kept drinking. As the night went on, he got louder, laughing at his own jokes and talking over her. Then he suddenly said he needed to pee on a rock and stumbled away. The girl looked embarrassed and started texting. He later returned with another guy, made a quick comment, and walked outside again. His friend followed, then came back alone and said he'd sent him home in an Uber before offering to take the girl to dinner. But about half an hour later, the guy walked back in, now sober. He apologized, bought drinks, and admitted he'd purposely acted like a fool so his friend could be the hero. "She's better off with him," he said. "She's not my type." I couldn't help but be both impressed and touched by the gesture.
My students use sign language during class, and I discovered something horrifying. I teach a class of 21 amazing kids, most of whom are really sweet, but one girl, let's call her Jane, seems to like me a little too much. Jane has autism and is always extra kind to me, often standing up for me if classmates are rude. She doesn't act this way with other teachers. Jane has a small group of friends, and one of them frequently glances at me while they talk, which feels unsettling. Her affection has been obvious for a while. On Valentine's Day, I received an anonymous rose, but I could tell it was from her because of the handwriting. She also comes early on Mondays, stays late, and shares personal stories. Sometimes she shows up to class with bruises, but that's probably another story. I hadn't confronted her behavior before, thinking I might be overreacting. Last week, something disturbing happened. Jane and her friends were using sign language during class. What they didn't know is that I understand sign language because my brother is deaf. While sitting alone, Jane was talking about me. She spoke about wanting to find out where I live, break into my home, and do things to me. She's been stalking me, following me from work to the bus stop, and even on social media. She also shared more unsettling fantasies. I'm horrified by what I've learned and unsure how to handle the situation. Drill sergeants. What's the funniest thing a recruiter's ever said during basic training? We had a guy nicknamed Big Bubba, 6 feet 5 inches with a Forrest Gump voice. One day in the chow hall, animal crackers were on the line, and the drill sergeant made it clear, don't touch them. Bubba didn't care. He grabbed a handful and went back for more. Sure enough, the drill sergeant caught him eating before sitting down. She stormed over, furious, threatening endless extra PT. Bubba just stood there, munching with a grin. When asked why he was smiling, he calmly replied, "Drill sergeant, you said not to touch animal crackers. These are animal cookies." The room went silent. The drill sergeant paused, hiding a grin. "All right," she said, "you've earned your cookies." We thought he'd outsmarted the system, but instead, she turned her wrath on us. We were ordered outside, trays untouched. Bubba later walked out with a big bag of crackers, enjoying them in the shade while we endured hours of brutal PT in the heat. What's a secret you've been keeping that could absolutely destroy your life if it ever came to light? A few years back, I agreed to help out a female friend's family by taking care of their beloved cat while they were out of town for a week. Each day during that week, I'd head over to their house to feed the cat and make sure everything was in order, but I couldn't resist my curiosity. One afternoon, as I was looking around, I stumbled across her personal diary. Instead of respecting her privacy and leaving it alone, I sat down and read the entire thing from start to finish. The information I found in those pages gave me such a deep insight into her thoughts and feelings that I ended up using it to my advantage. From that point on, I carefully used what I had learned to shape my conversations and actions to align with what I knew she liked and valued. Little by little, this strategy worked, and she started to like me back. Fast forward to today, and she's now my wife. To this day, she has no idea that everything I knew about her in the beginning came from her private diary.
My daughter broke into my son's apartment without permission and killed his cat. When Jake moved out at 18, the first thing he did was get a cat since he couldn't have one at home because of Amy's allergies. He gave us a key to his apartment, but made it clear it was for emergencies only. On Thursday, Jake was out of town for a wedding, leaving his place empty all day. Amy took his keys and went over with a friend to get ready because it was closer to their plans. While there, the cat was sleeping, and one of them accidentally stepped on it, killing it. In a panic, they left without saying a word. At 5 a.m., Jake called me, frantic and heartbroken. His cat was dead. He described coming home to find blood everywhere. I had no idea Amy had been there. During breakfast, I brought up Jake's call and Amy immediately panicked, confessing everything. By 11 a.m., Jake called again, calm but furious. Amy killed my cat, and you knew, didn't you? He accused, saying, I always let her get away with things. Now Amy is devastated, and I'm trying to console her, but Jake's anger is entirely justified. This version keeps the same structure and emotional weight while slightly altering the wording and flow. Fire me because I won't date your son? Fine, but you'll never see him again. When I started my job, being the youngest on the team didn't bother me. Things only got strange when my coworkers began trying to set me up with their kids. At first, it was flattering, but I soon realized I wasn't meeting my dream guy this way. So I told them to stop. Most did, but not my boss. He became fixated on me dating his son, pushing the idea daily and even forcing his son's number into my hand. To avoid confrontation, I saved it to my phone. That's when I realized I already had the number. His son was someone I knew from college, but even then I wasn't interested. When I refused again, my boss snapped. He gave me an ultimatum: date his son or get fired. I thought he was joking, until he fired me on the spot. What he didn't expect was what I did next. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and I was ready to make him regret it.
What is a fact that's not fun at all? Your lungs have a smell, but your brain filters it out so you don't notice it. The youngest person to ever give birth was only 5 years old. During World War I, thousands of family dogs were taken to support the war effort. When the war ended, most of them were shot because it was cheaper than feeding them or returning them to their homes. Horses cannot vomit. If they consume something toxic or develop a severe gas bubble, they often just lie down and die. In ancient Rome, urine was used for both teeth whitening and bleaching clothes. Yes, people rinsed their mouths with both human and animal urine. Holocaust survivors who develop Alzheimer's may believe they are back in the camps, reliving some of humanity's greatest horrors as they pass away, even decades later. There's a rare genetic condition called FOP, also known as human statue disease, where muscles and soft tissues turn into bone. People with this condition may eventually have to decide if they want to be permanently frozen in a sitting, standing, or lying position. The young girl who voiced Ducky in The Land Before Time was tragically murdered by her father before the movie was released. Her gravestone bears her iconic line, "Yep. What's the most heartbreaking thing someone's ever confessed to you? I used to work with this guy in his early 20s. He had a brilliant mind, but a body that seemed to betray him. It wasn't just that he wasn't in shape. You could tell something was seriously wrong. He moved like an old man, was constantly attending physical therapy, and sadly, some of the staff would mock him. They'd ask him to grab things from shelves they knew he couldn't reach, and even though he always brushed it off like it didn't bother him, I could see the pain in his eyes. One day, we happened to sit at the same table in the lunchroom. I decided to ask him what was going on with his health. He looked up from his plain ham and cheese sandwich and gave me this look. One of the most heartbreaking expressions I've ever seen. Then he told me, a few years ago, a girl he didn't know got into a fight with her boyfriend. In a moment of despair, she decided to end her life. She wrote a goodbye letter explaining everything, left it on her car's passenger seat, and sped off, slamming into the first car she encountered. That car was his. She walked away with barely a scratch, but he was left in chronic pain, likely for the rest of his life. Hearing his story broke me. It made me realize just how much some people carry with them every single day. What's the hardest thing you've ever had to do? My ex and I have been divorced for 7 years, and she finally admitted she'd been seeing another guy for almost a year, sleeping with him in our bed while I was at work. As soon as I found out, I left. That house was no longer mine. We share a 10-year-old son who was 3 at the time. For his birthdays and events, there's always one celebration with her side of the family and another with mine. Despite that, my ex still sends me invites to her events, and I always go. Why do I put myself through it? Because I refuse to be the parent who sparks the "how come dad didn't come to my birthday party" conversation. So I go, make small talk with her boyfriend and his friends, and push through. It's absolute torture, but I do it for my son. Most of the time, I make it through the cake and presents. Once I see my son happy and playing with his friends, I leave. Last summer, my son finally put me out of my misery. The weekend before his birthday, he handed me an invite and said, "Dad, here's the invite to Mom's party for me. It's just going to be Mom, her boyfriend, their friends, and their kids. I get it if you've got other plans. I'll see you next weekend at your party. That's the one I'm excited for." And just like that, he let me off the hook. What's the cringiest thing you've ever done during an interview? A friend's husband once had a job interview, and when he walked into the room, he saw 3 people seated behind a table, 2 men and a woman. He started on the left, shaking hands with the first guy, then moved to the second guy in the middle. When he reached the woman on the right, he extended his right hand, only to realize she had a prosthetic claw-like device instead of a right hand. She'd clearly dealt with this kind of situation before, so she calmly offered her left hand instead. But instead of just using his left hand for the handshake, he got so flustered that he ended up doing an awkward upside-down handshake, his right hand to her left hand. He left the interview convinced he'd blown it, with his brain screaming, "Why on earth did you do that?" To his surprise, he got the job. On his first day, he ran into the same woman who told him she found the whole thing hilarious. They worked together for a few years, and every time they saw each other, they'd recreate that bizarre upside-down right-to-left handshake. What's the biggest secret you're hiding right now? Sometimes I intentionally forget to hang up my phone after a call with my daughter-in-law. Right after, I'll start talking to my husband about how wonderful I think she is, how grateful I am that our son married her, and whatever other kind words I think might lift her spirits. I do this because she doesn't have a supportive family. Hers constantly tears her down. I've seen how much my words brighten her day, and the reason I know this goes back to something that happened a few months ago. One time, I accidentally butt-dialed her while I was talking to my husband about her. She stayed on the line, expecting to hear something bad, since that's what she's used to from her own family. family. Instead, she overheard me saying really kind things about her, and it moved her to tears. My son later told me it gave her a confidence boost that lasted for weeks. Since then, I've started doing it intentionally. Neither my son nor my daughter-in-law knows I'm doing this on purpose. They just assume I'm getting older and can't manage my phone properly. But as long as it makes her feel better, I'll happily keep forgetting to hang up. Make-A-Wish recipients and volunteers, what are some wishes you had to turn down? I was a Wish recipient, and after my health improved, I chose to give back by volunteering as a Wish coordinator. My original wish to attend the Oscars couldn't be granted since the Academy doesn't allow it. Instead, I went to the People's Choice Awards as a VIP. Make-A-Wish flew my family to LA, covered all expenses, and arranged a limo, dress, hair, and makeup. We walked the red carpet and sat near the stage. It was an unforgettable, once-in-a-lifetime experience. Including my siblings in my wish was very important because my illness had impacted their childhood. I'll always be grateful to everyone who made my wish possible. When I turned 18, I began volunteering as a Wish coordinator to give back. We'd meet Wish kids and their families, bring tailored gifts, and help define the child's true wish, ensuring it wasn't influenced by parents. The most common wish is a trip to Disney. Celebrity meet and greets are often declined because they can be vague, or the celebrity may not be available. The coolest wish I worked on was a $7,000 shopping spree for a boy confined to his room. He got a fully decked out gaming setup with video games, TVs, and a custom lazy boy chair. It was the ultimate gaming experience.
People who've survived being kidnapped, what's your story? Growing up, I always felt there was something off about my mom, but I still spent weekends with her. I genuinely believed she was harmless, until one morning I woke up to find she'd handcuffed me to my bed, like it was no big deal. For 3 days, I was stuck there while she fed me once a day and escorted me to the bathroom. When my dad came to pick me up, she covered my mouth and told him I didn't want to live with him anymore, but I was too shy to say it myself. Listening to her lie like that completely shattered me. And the worst part was, he believed her. I couldn't hold back my tears. That night, I used my tears to slip my hand free and ran to the nearest gas station. I called my dad, sobbing uncontrollably, and he came to get me right away. For a moment, I thought I was finally safe, but the nightmare wasn't over. My mom had woken up and followed me. She got to the gas station before my dad and tried to drag me into her car. Luckily, my dad arrived just in time to stop her. We drove off, but before we could even get home, police surrounded us. Without hesitation, they beat my dad and arrested him. It turned out my mom's boyfriend was a cop, and he believed her when she claimed my dad had kidnapped me. Thankfully, my dad eventually proved his innocence, and my mom was sent to the psych ward where she belongs.
Teachers, what's the best thing a student has ever said? One year, when I was teaching 8th grade, I had this really quiet kid in my class, along with one of those classic mean girl types. The girl was always trying to grab attention, saying things like, "You're probably my second least favorite teacher," and making fun of other students. It especially bothered me when she picked on the shy kid because he reminded me of myself at that age. One day, I assigned a group project and decided to pair her with the shy kid and 2 other boys. After some time, I noticed she wasn't doing any of the work and was just chatting with the boys, leaving the shy kid to do everything. I walked over and asked why he was doing all the work. The mean girl immediately claimed he was hogging it and wouldn't let them help. I knew that wasn't true, so I told her the rest of them could just finish it since he'd already done most of it. She responded, "No, it's fine. He can do it. He's a nerd anyway," and got a laugh out of the boys. That's when I told her, "You should be nice to him. He might be your boss someday." Without missing a beat, the shy kid finally spoke up for the first time. He said, "No thanks. I don't want to be a pimp when I grow up."
What's an excuse to call off work that your boss can't argue with? I had been with the company for about 6 or 7 months when I became seriously ill. It started with me collapsing in the server room. A coworker found me with a high fever and rushed me to the hospital. Things didn't improve. About a week later, I collapsed again, and my parents admitted me to the hospital. I could barely eat, talk, or walk. The doctors didn't know what was wrong, but it was clear something serious was happening. Over the weekend, my phone rang. Since I couldn't speak, my mom answered for me. My boss had called, asking for files. My mom calmly explained I was in the hospital undergoing tests to figure out why I needed blood transfusions, had lost 50 pounds, and couldn't keep it down. She gave him my room number and told him he could visit if he wanted. To my surprise, my hospital room soon filled with flowers and cards from my boss and coworkers. My boss felt terrible, and my team showed overwhelming support. After 10 days in the hospital, I was diagnosed with lupus. It took me 5 weeks to recover and return to work, but when I did, my team treated me with care and understanding. I'll always be grateful for having a workplace that genuinely cared.
Today, I messed up by accidentally texting my pregnant wife that this isn't working. This morning, I went to work and turned off my phone. When I turned it back on, I found almost 30 missed calls and texts from her, most asking how I could do such a thing. I had no idea what she was talking about, and when I tried calling her, she didn't answer. When I got home, I found her packing her bags to leave. I broke down. I had no idea what I'd done wrong. Eventually, she showed me a text where I said I wanted a divorce. That's when it hit me. Earlier, we'd had a freestanding mirror delivered. I texted her. The new mirror came in. I'm going to try to put it together, but I might need your help later. After struggling to assemble it, I sent another text. This isn't working, and at this point, I think I just need to give up. Apparently, the first text didn't go through, and only the second one was delivered. My wife panicked while I was completely unaware. Thankfully, I explained everything, and she understood. She's still shaken, but told me we'll laugh about it tomorrow. For now, I'm staying far away from ambiguous texts.
What's something a parent did that completely backfired on them? When my boyfriend and I found out I was pregnant in my early 20s, the lack of support and pressure from his family was overwhelming. My boyfriend came from a well-off, successful family. He was always by my side, attending every checkup and taking care of me, but his parents were strongly against the pregnancy. They insisted the baby wasn't his, claiming I was either lying or after their money for a better life. My boyfriend defended me repeatedly and even refused his dad's offer to do a paternity test. After my son was born, though, his parents visited me alone, demanding a DNA test. My boyfriend was firmly against it, but then out of nowhere, his mom started eating with his dad to drop the idea. She said they should just accept the baby and move on. I stood my ground and confidently told them we could do the test using both of their DNA samples. A few days later, the results came back, and my son was confirmed to be related to my boyfriend's mom, but not to his dad. What followed was a full-blown family drama. It turned out my boyfriend wasn't his father's biological son. After the revelation, his dad welcomed me and my son into the family, but just 3 months later, he filed for divorce, ending his 26-year marriage after discovering his wife had cheated on him all those years ago.
teachers. What's the best thing a student has ever said to you? Back when I was teaching 8th grade, there was this really shy kid in my class, along with one of those classic mean girls. She was always desperate for attention, saying things like, "You're probably my second least favorite teacher," and constantly picking on other students. It bothered me the most when she targeted the shy kid, because he reminded me so much of myself at that age. One day, I assigned a group project and decided to pair her with the shy kid and 2 other boys. After a while, I noticed she wasn't contributing at all and was just chatting with 2 guys, leaving the shy kid to do all the work. I walked over and asked why he was doing everything, and she immediately claimed he wasn't letting anyone else help. I knew that wasn't true, so I told them that the rest of the group could take over since he had already done most of it. She brushed it off, saying, "No, it's fine, he can do it. He's a nerd anyway," and got a laugh out of the boys. That's when I said, "You should be nicer to him. He might be your boss one day." Without missing a beat, the shy kid finally spoke up for the first time. He said, "No thanks. I don't want to be a pimp when I grow up." It was the most unexpected and perfect response I'd ever heard. I just realized how terrifying it is to be a girl. My girlfriend and I were at the mall, and as soon as we walked into a store, a man followed us in. At first, I didn't think much of it, but my girlfriend got quiet, and I noticed she seemed tense. After a few minutes, I asked if she was okay, and she told me someone was following us. When she pointed him out, I realized she was right. He was watching her through the shelves, always staying in the same aisle as us. We got separated briefly, and that's when he made his move. He approached her, and I could tell she was uncomfortable. I quickly walked over and put my arm around her. Even then, he ignored me and asked her out. I told him no, but he told me to stay out of it. My girlfriend stayed calm and asked him how old he was. When he said 27, she held up her phone, showed she had been recording, and told him she was 17. His face changed instantly, and he quickly walked away. When I asked her later how she thought to record him, she said this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. She said it was pretty common for guys like that to act creepy toward her. How did you meet your best friend? I found out my ex was cheating on me with him. That summer, my job hired a new guy named Mike. We hit it off immediately, spending our shifts joking around and laughing instead of working. One day, he told me he was hooking up with a girl, but was worried she might have a boyfriend because she kept ghosting him. I reassured him it was probably nothing. 3 days later, after a night out, I went to the bathroom, lifted the toilet seat, and found a yellow sticky note. It read, "Hey, bro, if you're reading this, she's cheating on you," followed by a phone number. I was in shock. I texted the number, and the guy on the other end confirmed he'd been coming over when I wasn't home. We decided to meet at a Starbucks. As I sat waiting, Mike walked in. I greeted him casually and asked what he was doing there. The moment the words left my mouth, it all clicked. We stared at each other in disbelief. Once we pieced everything together, we weren't even mad at each other. Instead, we planned to confront her. That night, I told her I'd be going out, and as we suspected, she invited Mike over, but I didn't leave. She panicked when she realized I was still there, quickly telling him not to come. I let him in anyway, and together we confronted her. I broke up with her on the spot, and from that moment on, Mike and I became best friends. We've been close ever since. While my wife was out with our kids, I stayed home until there was a knock at the door. When I answered, I was met by 2 police officers, their hats in their hands, and I could immediately tell by their expressions that it wasn't good news. Then, I heard the most devastating sentence imaginable. They said my wife's van had collided with a semi-truck, causing it to explode and claiming the lives of everyone inside. There were 4 victims, my wife and our 3 kids. My legs felt weak, and even though I'm not an emotional person, the pain hit me instantly. One officer stayed behind to comfort me while the other had to step away, visibly shaken. They informed me I needed to provide a DNA sample to confirm their identities, since everything had been burned beyond recognition. Still in denial, I tried calling my wife at least 10 times, but every call went straight to voicemail. Reality was starting to sink in. One of the officers offered to drive me to the station, and as I stepped out the door, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. The officer advised me to answer, saying it's good to take calls in situations like this. When I picked up, I heard my wife's voice. I couldn't breathe. She told me our van had been stolen from the parking lot. That was, without a doubt, the best bad news I've ever received. What's the best loophole you've ever discovered? At my university, they tried to encourage students to walk more by creating a system where we could download a specific health tracker connected to our accounts. The tracker would convert our steps into points, and those points would be redeemed for things like free coffee mugs, discounts, and the grand prize, a university hoodie worth about $30. The health tracker itself was pretty basic. It didn't allow you to manually log steps. However, it did let you sync with other health apps. I stumbled upon one that let me manually input my steps. So I started logging the equivalent of 50 kilometers per day. Within a few days of this walking, I had earned enough points to snag a hoodie or 2. I wasn't caught, and I told my friend about the trick. He took it to the next level and perfected a method to rack up even more steps daily. It turns out there's a hidden physical limit to how much someone can realistically walk in a day, but he bypassed this by setting his height to just 1 centimeter. Since shorter people need more steps to cover the same distance, the app calculated an insane number of steps for him. In the end, he racked up more than 10 hoodies and started giving them to anyone who asked. The university eventually noticed something fishy and sent him an email saying the activity had to stop, unless he could prove he genuinely walked that much.
When in your life did the trash take itself out? A few weeks into dating this guy, we were lying in bed, cuddling. Out of nowhere, he started brushing my hair with his hand. For most girls, this would have been sweet, maybe even romantic. But I wasn't most girls. I silently begged him not to brush too hard. Of course he did. The moment it happened, I felt a tiny rip at the front of my scalp. His reaction said it all. He shot up like he'd seen a ghost, his eyes wide with shock. I broke down into tears. I ran to the bathroom, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw the damage. My wig glue had come off, exposing my shiny bald scalp. Half of the wig was dangling at the back of my neck. I tossed it in the trash, pulled myself together, and walked back out. He was sitting on the bed, frozen in shock. I asked if I could sit, and he nodded. Before I could say anything, he blurted out, "Let me guess, you're a dude." I shook my head as tears rolled down my cheeks. His voice rose. What could be worse than that? Through my tears, I told him I have cancer. The color drained from his face. He gave me a half-hearted hug, mumbled, "I'm sorry," and left. It was heartbreaking at the time, but life has a way of turning things around. I beat cancer, my hair grew back, and the best part, that same guy messaged me after seeing my post about being cancer-free, asking if I wanted to go on a date. Rejecting him was one of the most satisfying moments ever.
What's the most a single dollar has ever gotten you? Back in junior high, I had a crush on a girl I flirted with quite a bit. During a band trip, we stopped at a gas station and she bought me a pack of gum. I tried to pay her back with $1, but she refused. So I slipped the dollar into her pocket. Not to be outdone, she slipped the same dollar into my backpack, and that's how the back and forth with the $1 bill began. We got creative with how we gave it back to each other. I once mailed it to her house, and she stuffed it inside a gum wrapper before offering me a piece. Eventually, I decided I'd ask her out using that dollar. I wrote, "Will you go out with me?" on it, slipped it into a note, and gave it to her. She said yes, because honestly, it'd be a terrible story if she didn't. About 4 years later, I still had that same dollar tucked away. On our anniversary, I added to it, writing, "Will you marry me?" at the bottom. We've now been married for 15 years, have 3 amazing kids, and still have that dollar stored away. What's the nicest thing you've seen a gang do? My mom was a 6th grade teacher in one of the roughest parts of Compton. In one of her classes, she had a group of boys who all came from very poor families. During lunch, they would always draw pictures of fancy, exotic cars. My mom would praise them for their talent, and they all promised that she would be the first person they'd take for a ride if they ever got a car. Many years later, one random day, my mom was heading home after finishing her teaching for the day. As she was walking to her car, she noticed a shady group of guys leaning against a car, staring at her. She felt nervous and tried to ignore them, but as she got closer to her car, she saw all of them walking toward her. She could tell they were all dressed like members of a gang, and they had weapons. One of the guys said, "Miss, we're here to take you for a ride." My mom was terrified, thinking she was about to be kidnapped. She reached for her pepper spray, but before she could use it, one of the guys calmed her down and said they were the same 5 boys she had taught years ago. After that, they took her to a fancy restaurant in their Cadillac and treated her to a meal. What's a loophole you used before anyone caught on? When I was a kid, my house was just down the street from Universal Studios. I'd go there every day after middle school. Over time, we figured out how to sneak into the VIP line for rides, which was always empty. Whenever a GU stopped us and asked for our VIP tickets, we'd casually say, "Dave should have called it in." After a few seconds of trying to confirm, they'd give up and let us through. We did this so often that the staff started recognizing us and just waved us through. It was perfect. One day, we decided to take things up a notch and sneaked into the studio area. Within 5 minutes, we got caught and questioned. Once again, we said our imaginary Dave told us to go back there. This time, the guards were way more thorough with their radio checks, and they actually got a real Dave on the line. It turned out Dave was a production manager. When he came to us, he gave us a puzzled look. The guards asked if we were with him, and to our surprise, he said yes. Dave then pulled us aside and asked what we were up to. We explained that we loved film and the studio vibe. He was so impressed by our passion that he gave us a tour of the studio, let us sit in on show recordings, and even handed us free passes and VIP access to return anytime. It was incredible. What's something your child has done that you know you'll talk about forever? Before her 12-month checkup, my incredibly bright daughter was already speaking in full sentences, which amazed everyone around us. At the appointment, a seasoned Navy pediatrician casually asked if she could talk. I answered honestly, yes, she can. Skeptical, he raised an eyebrow and asked me what her most recent word was. I explained that we had just gotten a brand new backpack carrier for her, and she had picked up the word backpack. With a smirk, he replied, "There's no way she can say that at her age." Without hesitation, Iris, who was across the room with her upper body buried in the office's toy box, lifted her curly head, looked him straight in the eye with the confidence of someone twice her size, and firmly stated, "I can say backpack." The pediatrician's jaw practically hit the floor, and I swear he looked like he was about to lay an egg. I just smiled, shrugged, and said, "Told you she could talk." Moments like that remind me why she's such a remarkable little girl. What's your worst, I know this looks bad, but I can explain moment? A female friend of mine who works as a police officer was performing a welfare check when the property owner's dog bit her. The bite happened about a mile from my house, and since I'm an EMT, she called me to ask if I could take a look at the injury and advise if she needed to visit the hospital. She arrived at my house and carefully walked into the kitchen, explaining how the dog had bitten her on the upper rear of her left thigh, just below her buttock. Concerned that the bite may have broken the skin, I told her I needed to examine it to see if she would require a bandage or possibly a rabies shot. She removed her duty belt and lowered her pants to her knees to show me the area. After inspecting the bite, I saw it wasn't too serious, but there were 2 puncture wounds from the dog's teeth. I told her I'd bandage it up so she could safely make the 20-minute drive to the clinic. Just as I was about to apply the bandage, my wife walked into the house. There I was, kneeling in the kitchen with our female friend in her police uniform, pants down to her knees and wearing a thong. Her thigh was right in front of my face, and my hands were on her upper leg. We both froze, wide-eyed like deer in headlights, fully aware of how bad this looked to my wife. At the exact same time, we both shouted, "It was a dog bite!" What's your Tinder horror story? Here's mine. After weeks of texting a girl way out of my league, I asked her out, and to my surprise, she said yes. When she walked in, she was so stunning, I could barely keep my composure. She greeted me with a smile and a hug, and I couldn't stop blushing. The date went great, but I didn't expect much, thinking she wouldn't be into me. At the end of the night, she gave me the most incredible kiss I've ever had. I was on cloud 9. A couple of months later, we were spending a lot of time together, and I realized I was falling for her. Then one day, she told me we needed to talk. She looked at me and said she had stage 4 cancer. Fighting tears, she told me she'd understand if I chose to leave. I was speechless, but finally told her I loved her and wanted to take this journey with her. Over the next year, we traveled and completed her bucket list. 9 months ago, she passed away in my arms as I sang her favorite song.
What's the worst thing you've ever agreed to because you were too afraid to say no? When my fiance and I went on our first date, I joked about Paris being my dream vacation destination. I don't even like Paris, but it was just a joke, and I didn't think much of it. 2 months ago, he surprised me with tickets to Paris. He was so excited, kissing me nonstop and talking about how thrilled he was to take me on my dream trip. He even confessed all the overtime he'd been doing at work was voluntary just to afford this trip. I was too embarrassed to admit the truth, so I went along with it. As the trip got closer, he kept bringing it up and saying how much he couldn't wait to go. The morning of the trip arrived, and at the airport, I realized I'd been pranked. He handed me my flight ticket, and instead of Paris, it said Rome, my actual dream destination. I looked at him, and he burst into laughter before admitting we were always going to Rome. He'd known I hated Paris, but decided to keep the joke going after seeing my reaction to the fake tickets. That week in Rome was the best of my life, and on our last day, he proposed to me.
I kicked my wife out because she tried to force my daughter into something she wasn't comfortable with. Emma was born the same day her mother passed. What's the most legendary thing a student ever did at school? This memory is unforgettable. It involved my buddy Nathan, who had a tendency to overreact. One day, he got really annoyed with our group of friends. To confront us, he followed us into the school bathroom, all fired up and determined to act tough. Convinced that one of us was hiding in a stall, he yelled, "Peekaboo, I see you," and kicked the stall door open. But it wasn't one of us in there. It was a teacher. Not just any teacher, but the no-nonsense one we all knew. The teacher calmly looked up and said, "I see you too, Nathan. Now, close the door." Nathan's face turned from confident to mortified in an instant. We were outside, barely holding back our laughter as he awkwardly mumbled an apology and closed the door. That moment spread around the school like wildfire, and even years later, we still laugh about it. It's one of those stories you never forget. What's the most inappropriate thing you've ever seen happen at a funeral? After my father's funeral, following both the service and reception, my mother, brother, sister, and I returned to our family home. Several of my father's siblings and their families were staying there with us. We arrived home a few minutes ahead of everyone else, and I was sitting at a table in the living room when I noticed their cars pulling into the driveway. They got out, hugging and seemingly congratulating each other. The reception after the service had been thoughtfully planned and turned out to be a lovely tribute, a celebration of my father's memory. So I assumed their cheerful mood was still carrying over from that. But then they came inside. They entered quickly and quietly, gathering around my older brother and me as we sat at the table. Their movements reminded me of kids huddling together, hoping to snag a cookie before dinner. My Aunt Barbara stood at the front, wearing a smug expression, and asked, "So, when are we going to do the reading of the will to find out what was left to us all?" My brother and I exchanged glances, stunned, before turning back to them. "Are you serious? Reading of the will, like in a soap opera? There is no reading of the will. Everything that belonged to my father now belongs to my mother." Their disappointment was painfully obvious, though there wasn't a shred of shame to be seen. They had planned to stay with us for a few more nights, but instead, they packed up and left that same afternoon. Women, what's your "I'm the client, not my husband, stop ignoring me" story? My husband and I were shopping for a new mattress. We agreed on the comfort level together, but I was the one making final decisions on price and warranty since I was footing the bill. Basically, I was the one who actually needed to deal with the salesperson. The salesperson wasn't a bad guy, just a little old-fashioned. He wasn't openly rude, but it was clear he was addressing my husband far more than me, even though I was the one with the money. I noticed, but whatever, I'm used to it. My plan was to get the info I needed, pay the man, and move on. Then my husband, bless him, wandered off like he just discovered furniture stores exist. Weird, but okay. A little while later, he came back and said, "Hey, can I have some cash? I want to check out this insert random decorative thing in the other section of the store." This was bizarre for two reasons. He's never been the type to care enough about a lamp or whatever to go investigate it. We don't normally do the "let me borrow some money" thing, but I handed him some cash anyway because why not? The moment he walked off, everything changed. The salesperson instantly shifted his attention to me. In his mind, I was suddenly the one calling all the shots. He started asking me about my job, making small talk, and treating me like the actual client. Thanks to that, I managed to negotiate a slightly lower price. I love my husband so much, he knew exactly what he was doing. When did a joke go way too far? There was a kid in our class named Luke who made sure things were never boring. Every day he'd crack jokes with teachers and classmates, always meaning well. Everyone loved him for it. One day, after lunch, we were all settling into class. Luke, being his usual funny self, decided to pull a prank. He planned to pull the chair out from under his friend just as he sat down, thinking it would be hilarious. By then, everyone was already in the room, except for his friend. When the friend walked in, we all knew what was coming. As he went to sit, Luke perfectly timed pulling the chair away, maybe a little too perfectly. The kid fell backward and hit his head hard on the corner of a desk. The room went completely silent. Nobody knew what to say as we waited to see if he was okay. Luke, looking absolutely terrified, rushed to help him. That's when the kid, struggling to get up, said something that still haunts me. He asked, "Why is it so dark in here? Can someone turn the lights back on?" He was rushed to the hospital where doctors found out that he'd hit his head in such a specific way that it caused permanent blindness. Luke ended up in serious legal trouble because of it, and even lost his scholarship. What's the closest call you've ever had?
Who is your real-life superhero? When a man forcibly stole my innocence, my father became my hero. He was determined to find the guy responsible and wouldn't rest until he did. He got a list of offenders in the area and asked me to point him out if I recognized him. The moment I saw the man, I couldn't breathe. I started hyperventilating and my throat tightened. Seeing me in such a state, my dad promised me that no one would ever suffer the way this man was about to. With the address from the list in hand, my dad grabbed his toolbox and drove off. For 3 days, the man suffered. Then things took a turn. While tied to a chair, the man started taunting my dad, graphically recounting what he had done to me and saying he'd do it again. My dad couldn't take it anymore and ended the man's life, a decision he hadn't intended to make. Afterward, my dad called me and said his life was over because of what he'd done. Knowing he wouldn't escape the consequences, he decided to use his remaining freedom to take down as many monsters as he could. He used the offender list to find the worst ones and went door to door, taking them out one by one. In the end, he managed to take out 7 people within a few miles before he was caught. My dad received multiple life sentences. The media didn't report much on his story because they didn't want to risk people seeing his actions as justified. But to me, my dad is a real-life superhero.
When did you first realize your child wasn't a child anymore? For me, it happened when my son was in 8th grade and got suspended from school. I had to leave work early to pick him up, and when I got there, I asked the principal what had happened. The principal told me my son had fought 3 boys and even broken one of their wrists. I was horrified and immediately demanded to know what my son was thinking. He calmly explained that the boys had cornered one of his friends and were trying to force her to strip. Being the respectful and protective boy I raised him to be, he stepped in and stopped them. I asked the principal if what my son said was true, but he avoided giving me a direct answer. Hearing that, I told the school that if they were going to allow this kind of harassment, I didn't want my son attending anymore, and I took him home. When we got home, I told my son I planned to pull him out of public school. To my surprise, he said he didn't want to leave. He told me that if he wasn't there, then who would stop something like this from happening again? That's when it hit me. My little boy had grown into a man. He was willing to face the consequences and take risks to stand up for what was right, even if it meant putting himself in the spotlight. Why'd they get in for free? Let me explain. I used to work as a bouncer at a bar where we charged a $2 cover on weekends. The only exception was for party buses. We had a deal with their operators to let their groups in for free since lively crowds were good for business. One night, a guy and his girlfriend walked in and I told him about the cover charge. He reluctantly handed over the $2 while grumbling. I casually mentioned, a $2 cover is the cheapest thing you'll spend here tonight. If that's an issue, this might not be the place for you. Not wanting to seem cheap, he paid. Not long after, he stormed back, upset because some people didn't have to pay. I explained the party bus rule and said those people likely came with a bus group. He pointed out some folks sitting with his girlfriend, claiming they hadn't come on a bus and didn't pay. I remembered them. They'd lied about being with a bus group. I admitted the mistake and suggested he let it go, but he wouldn't drop it. He loudly demanded a $4 refund to make it fair. At that point, I'd had enough. Instead of giving him a refund, I decided to fix the situation differently. I walked over to his friends, politely explained the misunderstanding, and asked them to pay the cover charge. The looks of betrayal they gave him were priceless. After collecting the covers, I thanked him for bringing it to my attention and went back to my post, leaving him to deal with their anger.
What's something your child has done that you'll cherish and talk about forever? My daughter was already speaking in full sentences before her 12-month checkup. At that appointment, the seasoned and slightly skeptical Navy pediatrician asked if she could talk, and I truthfully replied, yes. With a raised eyebrow, he asked what her latest word was. I explained that we'd just gotten a brand new backpack carrier for her, and she'd learned the word backpack. He smirked and dismissively said, she can't say that. Iris, who was 6 feet away, busy rummaging through the office's toy box with her curly-haired head bent low, suddenly lifted her head, locked eyes with him, and confidently stated, I can say backpack. The look of shock on his face was priceless. I thought the man was about to lay an egg. I couldn't help but smile and say, told you she could talk.
Don't tell anyone you're leaving, okay? Sure I won't. About 10 years ago, I had my first full-time job after college, and my boss seemed to decide out of nowhere that she hated me. I never figured out why, but she went out of her way to make my life miserable. She demoted me to an overnight shift without an explanation, constantly changed my schedule without notice, and even once altered my shift for the next day after I'd already left, then wrote me up when I didn't show up on time. She was a nightmare. So naturally, I started looking for a new job and eventually found one. When I went to give her my 2 weeks notice, it just so happened to be during a mass exodus at the company. I was the 5th person to quit in about 3 or 4 weeks. Morale was already rock bottom, and her solution to people leaving was to buy pizza for everyone, instead of addressing why the workplace was so miserable. After I handed in my notice, she looked at me and said, don't tell anyone you're leaving. I smiled and said, okay, then walked straight out of her office and announced to my coworkers, guess what, everyone? You're all getting pizza. They immediately knew what was up. She was furious, and I couldn't have been happier. I finished my 2 weeks, and she didn't say another word to me the entire time. Honestly, it was the most satisfying exit I could have hoped for. Teachers. What's the best thing a student has ever said to you? Back when I was teaching 8th grade, there was this really shy kid in my class, along with one of those classic mean girls. She was always desperate for attention, saying things like, you're probably my second least favorite teacher, and constantly picking on other students. It bothered me the most when she targeted the shy kid, because he reminded me so much of myself at that age. One day, I assigned a group project and decided to pair her with the shy kid and 2 other boys. After a while, I noticed she wasn't contributing at all and was just chatting with 2 guys, leaving the shy kid to do all the work. I walked over and asked why he was doing everything, and she immediately claimed he wasn't letting anyone else help. I knew that wasn't true, so I told them that the rest of the group could take over since he had already done most of it. She brushed it off, saying, no, it's fine, he can do it. He's a nerd anyway, and got a laugh out of the boys. That's when I said, you should be nicer to him. He might be your boss one day. Without missing a beat, the shy kid finally spoke up for the first time. He said, no thanks, I don't want to be a pimp when I grow up. It was the most unexpected and perfect response I'd ever heard.
When in your life did the trash take itself out? A few weeks into dating this guy, we were lying in bed, cuddling. Out of nowhere, he started brushing my hair with his hand. For most girls, this would have been sweet, maybe even romantic. But I wasn't most girls. I silently begged him not to brush too hard. Of course he did. The moment it happened, I felt a tiny rip at the front of my scalp. His reaction said it all. He shot up like he'd seen a ghost, his eyes wide with shock. I broke down into tears. I ran to the bathroom, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw the damage. My wig glue had come off, exposing my shiny bald scalp. Half of the wig was dangling at the back of my neck. I tossed it in the trash, pulled myself together, and walked back out. He was sitting on the bed, frozen in shock. I asked if I could sit, and he nodded. Before I could say anything, he blurted out, "Let me guess, you're a dude." I shook my head as tears rolled down my cheeks. His voice rose. What could be worse than that? Through my tears, I told him I have cancer. The color drained from his face. He gave me a half-hearted hug, mumbled, "I'm sorry," and left. It was heartbreaking at the time, but life has a way of turning things around. I beat cancer, my hair grew back, and the best part, that same guy messaged me after seeing my post about being cancer-free, asking if I wanted to go on a date. Rejecting him was one of the most satisfying moments ever.
What's the most legendary thing a student ever did at school? This memory is unforgettable. It involved my buddy Nathan, who had a tendency to overreact. One day, he got really annoyed with our group of friends. To confront us, he followed us into the school bathroom, all fired up and determined to act tough. Convinced that one of us was hiding in a stall, he yelled, "Peekaboo, I see you," and kicked the stall door open. But it wasn't one of us in there. It was a teacher. Not just any teacher, but the no-nonsense one we all knew. The teacher calmly looked up and said, "I see you too, Nathan. Now, close the door." Nathan's face turned from confident to mortified in an instant. We were outside, barely holding back our laughter as he awkwardly mumbled an apology and closed the door. That moment spread around the school like wildfire, and even years later, we still laugh about it. It's one of those stories you never forget. How does a high school legend actually become a legend? During one of our school dances, a heavy hailstorm hit and the power went out. Everyone ended up stuck in the gym, waiting out the storm together. To lighten the mood, one of the teachers suggested that students get up and tell jokes. At first, it worked. Students were laughing, but after a few jokes, the energy started to fizzle out. Then, another kid stepped up to the mic. He stood there silently for a few seconds before finally saying, "So, how deep are we willing to go, guys?" Without missing a beat, the entire gym erupted, yelling, "Balls deep." He was immediately pulled off the stage, and the joke-telling ended for the night. From what I remember, he got sent home and didn't show up at school the next day. Pretty standard stuff. Fast forward a year to graduation. At the end of the ceremony, instead of joke-telling, the school had karaoke. Midway through a song, the microphone mysteriously disappeared. As everyone was sitting in their seats, one guy stood up laughing. Turns out, someone had slipped him the missing mic. Teachers were frantically telling him not to do it, but he couldn't stop laughing. He raised the microphone and, with perfect timing, said, "How deep?" In that moment, I finally understood what school pride felt like. Almost 900 students yelled back in unison, "Balls deep." It was an unforgettable moment.
What's something your child has done that you'll cherish and talk about forever? My daughter was already speaking in full sentences before her 12-month checkup. At that appointment, the seasoned and slightly skeptical Navy pediatrician asked if she could talk, and I truthfully replied, "Yes." With a raised eyebrow, he asked what her latest word was. I explained that we'd just gotten a brand new backpack carrier for her, and she'd learned the word backpack. He smirked and dismissively said, "She can't say that." Iris, who was 6 feet away, busy rummaging through the office's toy box with her curly-haired head bent low, suddenly lifted her head, locked eyes with him, and confidently stated, "I can say backpack." The look of shock on his face was priceless. I thought the man was about to lay an egg. I couldn't help but smile and say, "Told you she could talk."
What's something your child has done that you know you'll talk about forever? Before her 12-month checkup, my incredibly bright daughter was already speaking in full sentences, which amazed everyone around us. At the appointment, a seasoned Navy pediatrician casually asked if she could talk. I answered honestly, "Yes, she can." Skeptical, he raised an eyebrow and asked me what her most recent word was. I explained that we had just gotten a brand new backpack carrier for her, and she had picked up the word backpack. With a smirk, he replied, "There's no way she can say that at her age." Without hesitation, Iris, who was across the room with her upper body buried in the office's toy box, lifted her curly head, looked him straight in the eye with the confidence of someone twice her size, and firmly stated, "I can say backpack." The pediatrician's jaw practically hit the floor, and I swear he looked like he was about to lay an egg. I just smiled, shrugged, and said, "Told you she could talk." Moments like that remind me why she's such a remarkable little girl. What's a secret you've been keeping that could absolutely destroy your life if it ever came to light? A few years back, I agreed to help out a female friend's family by taking care of their beloved cat while they were out of town for a week. Each day during that week, I'd head over to their house to feed the cat and make sure everything was in order, but I couldn't resist my curiosity. One afternoon, as I was looking around, I stumbled across her personal diary. Instead of respecting her privacy and leaving it alone, I sat down and read the entire thing from start to finish. The information I found in those pages gave me such a deep insight into her thoughts and feelings that I ended up using it to my advantage. From that point on, I carefully used what I had learned to shape my conversations and actions to align with what I knew she liked and valued. Little by little, this strategy worked, and she started to like me back. Fast forward to today, and she's now my wife. To this day, she has no idea that everything I knew about her in the beginning came from her private diary. Today, I messed up by accidentally texting my pregnant wife that this isn't working. This morning, I went to work and turned off my phone. When I turned it back on, I found almost 30 missed calls and texts from her, most asking how I could do such a thing. I had no idea what she was talking about, and when I tried calling her, she didn't answer. When I got home, I found her packing her bags to leave. I broke down. I had no idea what I'd done wrong. Eventually, she showed me a text where I said I wanted a divorce. That's when it hit me. Earlier, we'd had a freestanding mirror delivered. I texted her, "The new mirror came in. I'm going to try to put it together, but I might need your help later." After struggling to assemble it, I sent another text. "This isn't working, and at this point, I think I just need to give up." Apparently, the first text didn't go through, and only the second one was delivered. My wife panicked while I was completely unaware. Thankfully, I explained everything, and she understood. She's still shaken, but told me we'll laugh about it tomorrow. For now, I'm staying far away from ambiguous texts. What's the most heartbreaking thing someone's ever confessed to you? I used to work with this guy in his early 20s. He had a brilliant mind, but a body that seemed to betray him. It wasn't just that he wasn't in shape. You could tell something was seriously wrong. He moved like an old man, was constantly attending physical therapy, and sadly, some of the staff would mock him. They'd ask him to grab things from shelves they knew he couldn't reach, and even though he always brushed it off like it didn't bother him, I could see the pain in his eyes. One day, we happened to sit at the same table in the lunchroom. I decided to ask him what was going on with his health. He looked up from his plain ham and cheese sandwich and gave me this look. One of the most heartbreaking expressions I've ever seen. Then he told me, a few years ago, a girl he didn't know got into a fight with her boyfriend. In a moment of despair, she decided to end her life. She wrote a goodbye letter explaining everything, left it on her car's passenger seat, and sped off, slamming into the first car she encountered. That car was his. She walked away with barely a scratch, but he was left in chronic pain, likely for the rest of his life. Hearing his story broke me. It made me realize just how much some people carry with them every single day.